The Demon's Rapture. Chapter 3. Although he remained alert, he did not bump into anyone else, living or dead. Well into the neighborhood streets, the world seemed a lot quieter, and there was less destruction on the streets. Many of the houses appeared ransacked and gutted, the doors standing open, and some had smoke wafting through their windows in vacuum drafts. With the horrors of downtown behind him, he approached his house, the second to last on the block, and suppressed tears at the sight of it. All the windows had been smashed and its furniture lay scattered and burned on the front lawn, as if an explosion had blasted them out of the windows. He poked through the remains of his own clothing and bed sheets, smoldering in the wet grass. Inside the house, he found a disaster of trash and refuse, and could smell gunpowder on the air. He called the name of his wife and son as he moved from room to room, finding nothing more than the remains of his life, smashed and ground into the shag carpet. He dared to walk up the stairs, stepping over the broken handrail and calling vainly the names of his family, whom he knew were far from earshot. That didn't prevent him from scouring each room, closing the doors after him, one by one. Back in the street outside his house, he looked up and down the block, wondering what he should do. He had no intention of going back into that house, not without Laura or George, and he sure as hell didn't want to stand in the street all night. With tears in his eyes, Raymond looked at his watch. It was 4 p.m, leaving 8 more hours until the end, if he was to believe the prophecy in his dream. He gasped for breath, his throat constricting with choking sobs. Hyperventilating, he struggled to stay on his feet, and then cried out, doubling over with a splitting coughing fit. He heard voices yell out to him, and he looked up to see faces in the upstairs window of his neighbor's house, and they were smiling at him, laughing and yelling. He knew these people. They were calling for him to come inside. The front door had already opened, and hands were gesturing to him there. Gratefully, he limped inside, and the door was shut behind him, followed by a barricade of bookshelves and desks. The middle-aged woman standing before him was Margaret, a short, overweight woman who lived in the house with her husband and son. The young man pushing the barricades in place was her 19-year-old son, whose name escaped him at the moment. Raymond thanked them profusely, shivering in his surprisingly warm company. Looking around the house, he found that it stood in good shape, with the broken windows boarded up with wooden planks, giving the house a calm, dimming effect, like crawling inside a cave. There were more people standing on the stairs, waiting for Raymond. There was Todd, the neighbor from across the street, and Jack from the next block. They were worse for wear, pale and skittish. Todd looked to be injured, his long sleeves ripped off and tight round his shoulders to stop the bleeding there. Whether it was helping or not was not clear by the red color on his makeshift bandage. They led him upstairs and into the attic, where Raymond had seen them peeking from the window. There was one other survivor laying down on a cot in the attic, an elderly woman with a white sheet pulled up to her chin. Her face was ashen white and tight, giving Raymond the impression of a corpse, but the woman's chest rose and fell with her shallow breathing. Raymond didn't know the woman personally, but he had seen her sitting on the porch of a house a few doors down. She lived with her daughter, whom Raymond didn't see in the attic with the rest. He counted heads. There were 5 in all. Jack handed Raymond a bundle of blankets and encouraged him to change out of his wet clothes. Raymond nodded his head, but only managed to drape the heavy comforter over his shoulders and sit down on the floor in a warm bundle. The other survivors watched him gravely. "Where did you come from?" Margaret asked. "The hospital," he managed to say. Todd passed him a bottle of water, still cold, and he drank from it gratefully, handing it back half-finished. "Did you see any people?" She seemed to be careful how she framed the question, and Raymond understood why. "None that I can really call people," he answered dryly. She nodded slowly, looking at Jack, who hung his head and sat down on the edge of the cot with the elderly woman. Margaret's son had just finished pushing a bureau over the trapdoor into the attic, which was enough to settle Raymond's nerves, not that he was afraid of anyone trying to get in. The monsters walking around in the streets didn't seem to be concerned with any activity besides their destination, and if there were bad men out there looting and hurting people, then Raymond had just missed them. It looked like a quarantine area out there, minutes after total evacuation. Raymond couldn't rule that out just yet. Perhaps the disaster was only central to his town, or his state, and nowhere else. Maybe help was on its way. "Laura? And George?" Margaret asked. Raymond shook his head. "They were missing this morning. I went out to find them, and I was rushed to the hospital. This is how I woke up." "And let me guess, you had a dream?" Tom said from the window. He turned his back on Raymond and looked out. "This is revelation, and we're all being punished." It occurred to Raymond at that moment that none of the people in the attic deserved to be in their situation. He knew Margaret well enough. She volunteered a lot of her time at the community center, organizing charity events for underprivileged kids. Her son was a valedictorian with a scholarship to a medical school next year, with a passion for helping people and saving lives. Todd was a counselor at the high school and helped teenagers cope with peer harassment and parental abuse. Jack was retired at the age of 50 and had 3 beautiful children, adopted from abusive households. Raymond couldn't help but notice he was alone. Without any of his family members by his side, Raymond would find out that each one of them had lost somebody to the rapture. Margaret had lost her husband, Todd his wife, Jack his wife and kids, and the elderly woman in the cot, named Mrs. Tinley, had lost her entire family, daughter and granddaughters alike. "But you, Ray," Todd said with disbelief. "I thought you were safe for sure with your family. I mean, you're the most charitable man in the neighborhood. I always see you at church, lending help wherever you can." "And why are we left while our families are gone?" Jack asked from the cot. He was honestly looking at Raymond for an answer, who could only look away and regard the far wall. "We're not bad people. It just doesn't make sense," Todd said. He placed his hand on the window and pressed his forehead against it. "What exactly did you dream?" Raymond asked. Margaret was the only one to meet his eyes, so he followed up his question with her. "Did we all see the same thing?" "Well, if you saw Christ, then we did too," she responded. "He told us we were to suffer the apocalypse while our families would be freed." "And how did this all start?" Raymond asked. "There was a lot of violence," Margaret said. "I tried not to look outside, and we held up in here. People were trying to make their escape, but the traffic made it impossible for people to leave," Margaret's son continued. He sat down next to Raymond, with his back against the wall. He stared up at the ceiling in deep thought. "I heard the violence was worse in town. You must have seen it for yourself." Raymond could only nod. "What else did you see?" The boy looked Raymond in the eyes. "I saw a dead man get up and walk away," Raymond said with a sick feeling in his stomach. "There were hundreds of them, all walking toward the center of town. They were all dead, bleeding, and they had red eyes," Jack said. "I saw them walking around outside. Once the looters quieted down, those zombies started taking to the streets, all walking in the same direction." Raymond sat up with interest. "Where are they going?" "I've heard there's a bottomless pit in the center of the town, and they're all walking into it, like they're hypnotized or something," the kid explained. "Where did you hear this?" Raymond had to ask. "There was someone in our group. He said he escaped the crowd downtown, where people were being trampled in the streets, just trying to run across the city limits." The kid stared at his hands, tugging on his own fingers. "He said he saw the ground open up with fire. The dead were getting up off the street and walking in." "What happened to him?" "He was badly hurt." Margaret hesitated to answer for her son, who looked grateful to accept the silence. "He died of his wounds downstairs. We had to take him outside so he couldn't bother us in here. An hour later the lawn was bare, and the sheet we rolled him in was empty. He just got up and joined the crowd." "They don't even notice us, or don't even care," Todd said. "I've stood here at this window and yelled down at them as they walk by. Usually they look up, just to see who it is. But they never move toward the house or look angry. They even smile before they look away and ignore me completely." "What does that mean? That they don't attack us?" Jack questioned. "It might not mean anything," Todd replied with a shrug of his injured shoulder. "Would we expect them to attack us? How should we know what to expect from actual zombies in the street?" "What if this is a test? To see who can survive the longest?" Margaret's son asked suddenly, but only half the room had heard him. They all had questions to be answered. "What if these dead people are possessed by demons?" Margaret said. "What do you think will happen at midnight?" Todd asked. "Why would God do this to us?" "What did we do?" Raymond stood up and caught all of their eyes. "Please, we need to think of a way out of this," Todd scoffed, turning around to face him. "Where could we escape? We only have a few hours left." "We could find help in the next town," Raymond sighed, aware that his words were falling upon deaf ears. "What if there are other survivors out there? For God's sake, we have to try something. The fact that we have so little time makes it that much more important. We just can't sit around here and wait for the 4 horsemen. I'm not sure there are other survivors, but they won't be surviving for long." That came from Margaret's son. He did not sound happy with what he had just said, but he spoke it as though it was the truth. "We can't leave Mrs. Tinley here," Margaret replied sadly. She motioned toward the sleeping woman in the cot. "She's too weak to walk, and we can't just carry her out there." Raymond nodded that he understood and sat down again. The room seemed to settle with the new change of nervous energy, which acted like a ticking clock for their background. Raymond hung his head and waited, bracing his back against the wall. In this way, he fell asleep instantly. Chapter 4. Raymond woke up to the sound of scuffling feet and a crying woman. It was dark, only a shred of natural light from the moon outside the window, and he was able to read his watch. It was only a few minutes before midnight, and his neighborhood was just as quiet as before, except for the new excitement in the attic. He sat up straight to watch Margaret pulling her son back by the arms, begging him through her tears to stop. Jack and Todd had just entered the fray and were trying to calm them both down. The kid looked to be in the process of moving the piece of furniture from the trapdoor. "Mom, I'm going out there," the kid screamed at Margaret, who only cried louder. "There's nothing keeping me here, or you. Let me go out there and face whatever it is instead of hiding in this fucking attic. Raymond's right." Raymond looked at Mrs. Tinley, still breathing soundly in her bed. "We can talk about this," Todd said. He grabbed for the kid, but he pushed Todd away into the wall. "Don't touch me," he screamed. Raymond stood up, balancing himself against the wall and allowing the comforter to slip off his shoulders. "Come on," he said. "Let's stop this." The kid heaved open the door and Jack caught him in the headlock, struggling to pull him back. Margaret screeched and something heavy was overturned. Raymond was able to watch Margaret as she fell backward against a pile of boxes in the corner, landing in a dusty heap. Her son sprang after her, with Jack dragging him down like an anchor. In this way, they both fell over, smashing the kid face first into the hardwood floor. The entire attic shook, and Raymond scrambled to pull Jack off. Raymond leaned forward and received a blind elbow in the face, and he scurried away into the wall, banging his head painfully. Todd hurried to his side, apologizing for hitting him accidentally. Somewhere, Margaret was whining under her breath, calling her son's name, who was now unresponsive. Jack was able to carry the boy to a bundle of blankets on the floor and leave him there. "God damn it," he cried, checking the boy's pulse. Margaret and Raymond stood by helplessly, holding their breaths. "Is he alive?" Raymond cried. Jack cursed again, and Todd shoved him aside to inspect the boy's face, which was complete with a broken nose and some missing teeth. The boy struggled to breathe through the bubbles of blood through his mouth, and Todd quickly wiped his face clean and rolled him over on his side. "What did you do? What did you do?" Margaret screamed at Jack, pounding on his head with her open hands. He tried to crawl away from her, hands over his head. In the corner, Mrs. Tinley shot out of her sleep, eyes glassy and staring. She shrieked, and everyone grew silent. They watched as the room filled with bright light, sliding over the walls and ceiling like cool vapor, and easing them all into submissive positions, sitting on the floor with their muscles giving way. Here was the figure from their dreams, now standing before them, a foot above Mrs. Tinley's cot. The figure seemed to wear the light as his robes, shrouding himself in starlight, and the radiation from the sun, and the reflection of the moon. He spread his arms to envelop the room, and they felt the man's unconditional love for them, and only for them. Raymond realized that their group was the most important alliance left on the planet, and the last show on Earth was for them. But now it was all going to be fine. They would be delivered safely home to their waiting families. Mrs. Tenley shrieked again as she stared up at the man enshrouded in light, and her eyes rolled back in her head. The Christ figure reached down for her and managed to take her hand in his. Mrs. Tinley was drooling, foaming at the mouth, and her head lolled to the side. "Do not be afraid," the man said. "I have come to lead you far from here. You are the last survivors in your town, and you should not be here to witness the end." Margaret burst into tears of joy, rejoicing in thanks and bowing her head in prayer. Todd and Jack stared in awe at the figure from their knees, and Raymond couldn't even find his breath. He kept trying to peer through the glare and see Christ's features, his eyes or his mouth, the thin bridge of his nose or his dark locks of hair, but the light was too intense, and he found he couldn't look at it for more than a few seconds. "Take a hold of my robes now, while your son needs saving. I will take us into heaven, where you may be reunited with your loved ones." Margaret did not need to be asked twice. She took her son's hand, and then reached up to take a handful of Jesus' robes, which settled in her palm like a tail of mist. Todd and Jack reached out with both their hands and hung on to the figure's robes. Todd buried his face in the white light, and half of his body appeared to disappear as if dunking his head under water. "And you, Raymond, will you not take my hand and follow me home?" the voice asked him, speaking from inside his mind. "You take me home now?" Raymond said. "After all this, you come for us now?" The light intensified around the glowing man, and Raymond felt his eyes droop, muscles reduced to putty. "Will you refuse a reunion with your wife and child?" Christ asked. "Come now, Raymond, take my hand." He felt his stomach turn around inside him, the ground dropping out under his knees. Fingers touched his face, cold and scaly. They were Christ's hands, and they were wrapping around his throat. "You survived, Raymond," the voice said. "You came this far, but you cannot go any further. Time to sleep, and you'll be with your family when you wake." He was drifting down, down, and those fingers were tightening around his flesh, reeling him forward. Through a fog lens, he watched the figure extend several more arms from his chest, which clamped their incandescent claws across every other survivor's throat, even the old woman. They were all subdued, catatonic, and staring into the bright light. The arms retracted into the figure's robes, taking the survivors with it. "No!" Raymond screamed, and the figure started back, the light flickering around its body. "I demand for you to stop this!" The pressure around his neck loosened, and Raymond pulled back, landing on his feet. He shielded his eyes from the light with a heavy hand. "I demand that you show yourself, demon!" Raymond cried. "Show us your true form!" Then the light snuffed out in an instant, and Raymond found himself in a dimly lit attic, pooled with moonlight. The figure standing before him was no longer robed or holy. It was hunched over and smoking like a match. Raymond hiccuped in fear, his knees finally buckling under him. He slid down the wall behind him with a slight squeak. The figure stood upright and the face was revealed. It resembled a man with ink-black skin and red eyes, glowing like two red-hot coals from his skull. His mouth was drawn back savagely to show off his decaying teeth. As if his body was a torch that had just been ignited, flames licked up his back and through his hair. Flames melted away his face, and Raymond could hear his flesh sizzle and smell it as it burned. His hair wasn't affected by the fire. His black locks swung along his shoulders in a mesmerizing fashion, like there was a breeze tickling his back. The eyes seemed to split like eggshells, and they were filled with electricity. They shone brightly with a magnificent red light, pulsing like diodes in the darkness. Blood oozed from his burns in his forehead, yet his smile never faltered. The fire licked around his robes. but his clothing did not burn like his skin. He wasn't actually on fire. He had created the flames somehow, produced them like natural sweat. His nose creased down sharply and his cheeks became rugged desert landscapes. Large black shadows spawned from the ends of his eyes, his teeth chipping away from their lifeless black gums. The flames on his back grew brighter and bigger as he changed. His serpent tongue flicked out between his charred lips, black and rotting with green mold. The creature's eyes dug into Raymond's skull and prodded at his thoughts with a fire poker of immense heat. Raymond tried to scream, but the pain in his body was unbearable. Raymond could hear millions of voices hissing in his mind, all the voices of the dead, and they were happy he was dying. Finally dying. The figure's eyes grew as big as pulsing suns, each with tiny pupils that shrank and expanded randomly. Raymond's knees caved in and he fell onto his back. The demon's face cracked like a piece of porcelain as his mouth opened wide. The eyes were swimming with sparks of color, all the colors imaginable. Raymond cried out savagely inside his mind, but the voices only screamed back in return. He could hear the choir of the damned, a million unholy voices laughing within his mind, prodding and poking. The demon screamed with pain as fire consumed his entire body. His eyes burned like supernova suns. He exploded in a shower of sparks, and Raymond fell over on his side, his mind suddenly clear and light. Sleep fell upon him in a wave, and he rode it out to the sea. Epilogue. Once every month, Raymond, Todd, Jack, Mrs. Tinley, Margaret, and her son met in the attic of Margaret's house to gather on the floor and pray as a group. They thought it was only right, because it was important for them to remember the day the earth almost ended, while everyone else had forgotten. It was as if the day had never happened, even though the memory of it was still fresh in their minds. The 6 of them had been the only ones to experience the apocalypse. The next morning they woke up in their beds with their families, with their wives, husbands, and their children. The town hadn't been destroyed and was still in one piece. The dead were not walking the streets, and a bottomless pit was yet to be formed at the center of town, and they were the only ones who had memory of that horrible day, and their final altercation with the demon in the attic. They were all blessed with nightmares, though they still had a place in reality. Each of them could recall with expert clarity what happened that day, up until the Christ figure appeared before them in a cast of light. Raymond had to tell them the rest of the story, where the being had shown its true form. Apparently Raymond had defeated the creature in that last minute, resetting the doomsday clock back to 0. But was it still counting? Though they wanted to believe they had shared the same dream for some inexplicable reason, they still held an enormous responsibility for the safety of their loved ones and the town. Perhaps they had seen into the future somehow, at the inevitable scene to come, and they could prevent it. Or perhaps they had been the participants in a cruel virtual reality created by the demon for its own enjoyment. What remained certain was the realization they carried with them every night they went to sleep, kissing their partners goodnight as if for the last time. It was the realization that they shouldn't jump to trust anyone, just because he can appear before them in a shaft of white light. Every night Raymond prayed to meet the demon again in his dreams, just so he could refuse him one more time, and discard him into the darkest pit of his own unconscious. Raymond had braved the apocalypse and survived. Although he hadn't quite made it to midnight, he wondered what happened after that. He wondered what it would be like to step off the cliff into a bottomless pit and fall forever. Even though the fantasy gave him a dark thrill in his stomach, it was better he didn't find out.